What if I told you that one of the most impossible victories in human history, a victory that defied logic, mathematics, and even the laws of warfare, began with a king who was never supposed to win at all? Before sunrise on October 25, 1415, a muddy field in northern France became the stage for a mystery historians still debate today. How did just 6,000 starving, exhausted English soldiers defeat more than 20,000 heavily armored French warriors? And here's the real question, the one almost no one asks. Was this victory truly skill or something far more unsettling? Henry V's army was broken long before the battle began. Marching for weeks through enemy territory, starving from disease, soaked by unending rain, and cornered between forests, they knew they weren't simply outnumbered. They were being hunted. The French didn't see the English as an army. They saw them as prey that had finally been driven into a trap. Yet as dawn broke, something about the battlefield felt wrong, almost intentionally wrong. The English stood on one narrow, muddy field, flanked by dense woods on both sides. The French, confident with their tens of thousands of knights, believed this terrain would crush the English line. The French didn't realize that this perfect killing ground they chose was actually perfect for the English. The terrain they believed would help them overwhelm Henry's army was the exact thing that would choke, slow, and suffocate their own charge. They had unknowingly engineered their own disaster, but the French didn't see it yet. They believed victory was inevitable. Henry V, though, understood something they didn't. He positioned his longbowmen in a shape that had never been used before on the scale, an angled, forward-leaning formation that created a funnel of death. It was subtle, brilliant, and invisible to anyone not looking for it. Still, even the most brilliant formation couldn't solve the deeper problem. The English were exhausted, diseased, and running out of arrows. And the French numbers were overwhelming, towering knights in full-plate armor, banners stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. As both armies stared across the field on that cold, mist-soaked morning, a heavy silence fell. The French mocked the English. They joked about how they would capture Henry, ransom his nobles, and slaughter the rest. Some even argued over who would claim which prisoners before the battle even began. Henry watched them in silence. Henry V's decision to attack first hit the English line like a shockwave. These men were already weak, bloodied, and exhausted, yet now their king, was marching straight toward the strongest army in Europe. No general in their right mind would have done this, but that was precisely why it worked. The French weren't ready. Their knights were still mounting. Their formations weren't set. Their commanders were still arguing over strategy and bragging about the ransom money they would earn once the English inevitably surrendered. Henry's sudden advance shattered every expectation they had carefully built. Still, the English didn't charge blindly. Their front line moved deliberately, slowly, almost tauntingly toward the French. Every step made the French angrier. Every step forced them to react before they were ready. Henry wasn't trying to overpower them with numbers. He was trying to provoke them into making a fatal mistake. And then it happened. Henry V ordered his longbowmen to do something almost no one remembers today. He commanded them to carry sharpened wooden stakes, heavy, awkward, and normally useless in open field combat. But these weren't weapons, they were traps. As the English advanced, the longbowmen plunged these stakes into the ground at an angle, forming a deadly barricade. To the French knights, it looked like a pathetic, desperate gesture, wooden sticks against steel-clad cavalry. But they had no idea how lethal that simple idea would become, because once the stakes were planted, the real attack began. Henry stepped behind the archers and raised his sword. In an instant, 6,000 Englishmen drew arrows to their ears. The French still hadn't fully moved. They were still adjusting armor, closing visors, tightening straps. Then Henry dropped his sword. A black storm erupted. Arrows, tens of thousands, screamed across the field. The sound was like ripping cloth mixed with thunder. French horses panicked. Knights staggered under the relentless rain. Arrows couldn't always pierce plate armor, but they didn't need to. They pierced joints, visors, horses, and flesh exposed beneath the weight of steel. The French lines convulsed. Their commanders shouted orders drowned out by chaos. Some knights attempted to charge, but mud trapped their horses like quicksand. Others slipped, fell, and were trampled by the weight of their own men. Henry's gamble was working. Yet even as the French advance buckled, a darker problem loomed. The arrows were running out. The French vanguard, tens of thousands strong, was still advancing. And once they reached the English line, the longbowmen would be forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat, something they were never meant to survive. Then came the moment no historian can explain. The French first line, enraged and humiliated by the English arrows, launched a full charge, one so massive the ground shook. Henry watched the horizon darken with armored bodies, a wave of steel crashing forward. The English line braced. And this leads to the next cliffhanger, because that unstoppable French charge, powerful enough to erase the English army in minutes, suddenly began to collapse, and no one could understand why. Because he had already made a decision, one that stunned even his closest commanders. Instead of waiting for the French to advance, Henry prepared to initiate something bold, something reckless, something no historian can fully explain. He wasn't going to defend, he was going to attack. His entire army froze. Attack against an enemy 3 times their size. In the mud, with weakened men, it sounded suicidal. But Henry V stepped forward with one command that would set the entire disaster or miracle in motion. And what he did next is so shocking, historians still argue whether it was bravery, madness, or something else entirely. Because Henry didn't just order an attack, he personally led it, straight into the largest army France had ever assembled. The French charge should have been the moment everything ended. Tens of thousands of armored knights crashing forward at full force. This was the kind of impact that shattered enemy lines, crushed infantry formations, and broke armies in seconds. But what happened next didn't look like a glorious charge. It looked like a disaster unfolding in slow motion. As the first ranks thundered ahead, the ground beneath them betrayed them. Days of relentless rain had turned the Agincourt field into a swamp disguised as soil. Horses stumbled mid-stride. Steel boots sank inches deep. Entire clusters of knights toppled before even reaching the halfway point. And yet the chaos ran deeper than mere mud. The French formation was too tight, so tight that every fallen knight became an instant obstacle. Those behind couldn't see the bodies piling up, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The front lines weren't advancing, they were drowning. It wasn't just mud, arrows, or bad planning. Henry's wooden stakes had created a lethal bottleneck that forced the entire French vanguard into a narrow, crushing funnel. The French didn't know it, but they had walked directly into a trap engineered not by terrain, but by the English themselves. As knights hit the stakes, horses reared, men lost balance, and the formation behind them slammed forward with unstoppable weight. It became a living avalanche, knights suffocating beneath their own comrades, crushed by hundreds of pounds of steel and bodies. The English archers, seeing the chaos, dropped their bows and grabbed axes, mallets, knives, anything they could swing. They weren't trained for this kind of combat, but they didn't need training. The French were immobilized, barely able to lift arms or weapons. What should have been the French army's greatest advantage, its heavy armor, had turned into a metal prison. The longbowmen waded into the mass of knights, striking exposed joints and cutting throat openings. French knights at the back screamed for space. Horses behind them tried to reverse, only to get entangled and fall. Panic spread faster than orders. Henry V himself plunged into the front, fighting shoulder to shoulder with his men. Witnesses later swore that the king's armor was dented and slashed, that he fought so close to the chaos, he nearly died multiple times. But Henry refused to retreat, shouting orders through the mud and blood. Still, the French numbers were overwhelming. More and more reinforcements pressed from the rear, each wave adding weight to the crush. Even pinned and suffocating, tens of thousands of knights pushed forward with sheer momentum. The English were killing hundreds, maybe thousands, but their line was buckling. Exhausted archers stumbled. Infantry clashed with fresher French soldiers. If even one section collapsed, the entire English army could be enveloped. And then, at the height of the chaos, something unthinkable happened. A group of French knights managed to break through a side gap and sprint toward the rear English line, heading straight for the baggage train, where the English camp followers, supplies, and even potential hostages were kept. Henry turned and saw them. If they succeeded, the English position would fall apart instantly. Because those French knights weren't just raiding the baggage, they were after something specific, something so dangerous that Henry V made the most controversial order of his entire life. Henry V watched in disbelief as a detachment of French knights bypassed the frontline chaos and charged toward the English rear. This wasn't a random raid. This wasn't desperation. These men were targeting something critical, something the French commanders believed could end the battle instantly. The English baggage train wasn't just filled with wagons and supplies. It held prisoners, nobles the English had captured earlier in the campaign. If the French freed them, or worse, armed them, the English army would be attacked from behind while still locked in a brutal front-line struggle. One strike, two fronts, total collapse. Henry instantly understood the stakes. The battle, his entire campaign, was hanging by a thread. The English line was stretched thin, exhausted, and outnumbered. A surprise assault on the rear would finish them. But what Henry did next would become one of the most debated decisions in medieval history. Henry V ordered the execution of thousands of French prisoners, many of them nobles, to prevent them from joining the attack. To his own soldiers, it was unthinkable. Knights didn't slaughter captured nobles. It was dishonorable, unprecedented, and financially insane. These prisoners were worth fortunes in ransom. But Henry's logic was brutally simple. Better to lose gold than to lose the kingdom. His men obeyed reluctantly. The sound of steel against defenseless captives echoed behind the English lines as Henry raced forward to face the French assault. The knights attacking the baggage weren't expecting resistance, and when Henry's reinforcements arrived, they were crushed quickly. With the rear secured, Henry turned back to the main battlefield. What he saw was almost otherworldly. The French advance, the massive tidal wave of armored knights, had frozen into a single enormous mound of bodies. Hundreds choked beneath layers of their own men. The survivors were too tightly packed to swing swords or raise shields. Many were suffocating. Others were trapped upright, unable to fall or move. The English archers, now wielding knives, hatchets, and hammers, moved through the chaos like ghosts among statues. One by one, the French vanguard broke, not from the English strength, but from its own impossible weight. When the final French line saw the catastrophe unfolding ahead, they hesitated. They were fresh, uninjured, well-armed, but the sight of thousands of knights crushed in mud and steel drained their courage. Some commanders tried to rally them, others attempted to flee. The field was a graveyard before the battle even ended, and then, without warning, the French line collapsed. A retreat turned into a rout. In less than an hour, the greatest knightly army in Europe was shattered. The Battle of Agincourt wasn't won by numbers. It wasn't won by strength. It wasn't even won by luck. It was won by three things: a trapped battlefield, a king who understood psychology better than his enemies, and a moment of ruthless decision that changed the outcome of the 100 Years' War. Because the real secret of Agincourt is this: the French weren't defeated by the English, they defeated themselves. If you want more deep, dramatic breakdowns of the battles that changed history forever, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me which legendary battle you want next.